Hello, my name is Matthew, and there's been a great discussion making its rounds on BookTube recently on the topic of subjectivity versus objectivity, how we appreciate and enjoy and critically assess art, works of literature. I first saw this recent wave of conversation on Christy Luis and Dostoevsky in Space. Her channel reacting to another video. I think his name was Michael Quinn, another booktuber that I'm not very familiar with. And in the original video, he was rather provocatively, and I think mostly in tongue-in-cheek, saying that the only things that can be viewed objectively about a book are things like page count. Everything else is completely subjective. And Christy Luis made a reaction video, which was quite fun and friendly, but responding with objections that clearly there are elements of a book that can be either critically assessed or just generally appreciated objectively. And it's a fun conversation that's taken off. There's been a lot of great other booktubers. Steve Donahue has weighed in, Hannah from Hannah's Books, and Brian with his now infamous penguin analogy, and I'm sure there's much more. I know Christy Luis made a playlist of all the videos that are connected to this conversation, and it really got me thinking. When this kind of conversation, this topic comes up, I usually think, for one, clearly there's objective elements in a book that can be weighed, determining whether or not it's competent, enjoyable. Things like the story itself, the plot, the richness of characters, psychological depth. There's all those really obvious things that'll either make a great book or an average book. But and the books that we're mostly talking about, if it's a book that's sold online or in a store, and it's been bought enough that people are reading the book, and you can talk about the book, and there's a general lively discussion about it. Those kinds of books, which are the books that pretty much everyone's reading anyway, are going to have a sliding scale of objective and subjective elements that either give the book virtues or drawbacks. And I often think that one of the big things kind of missing in this kind of discussion, it's usually my first thought, is that most books are objectively awful, bad. The majority of books from when people first started writing things down to being in print and published for 2,000 years, the majority of them are bad. And that's all the way up until now. Most books go out of print. Of course, there's more amazing beautiful books that can just swallow you whole. There are more amazing books like that than you can read in a lifetime. But there's a lot more pretty good books, and even more average or mediocre books, and books that kind of fall flat and were disappointing. The largest portion of that pie chart are genuinely awful, boring, horrendous stories. And like I said, it's nothing new. This was, I imagine that we had this story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we had this really rosy picture that of a story that was a part of the oral tradition. It was told from campfire to campfire, night after night, storyteller to storyteller, generation after generation, father to son, mother to daughter. And through all of this, people are adding to the story of the Odyssey, or putting in elaborations, exaggerating certain parts. And it all grew into these two fantastic, everlasting, epic poems. Apparently there were more that got lost, but I don't really think that's the case, or how it works. Of course, we ended up with these great poems, but I imagine for every one poetically minded storyteller in ancient Greece that had memorized a portion of the Iliad of the time, for every one of those people that added a little bit extra that people loved and wanted to hear more of, for every one of that person, there were, I imagine, 100 or 1,000 other Greek boring blowhards at the campfire reciting a portion, adding their little bit that was awful. People would be getting up from the campfires and walking away, or saying, at a time where there's no other books, there's no radio or television, there's no music to be listened to, that person that would come and be their only source of entertainment, and at the end of the day they would sit down, and it's the person that you don't ever want to hear a story from, and the person that most confidently asking everybody, do you want to hear me recite the great story of the Odyssey? And I imagine there were people with no other options that would say, from you, we would prefer silence. We don't want to hear your horrible rendition or additions to these stories. You'd have one campfire with 100 people around, totally enthralled with an amazing poet with the gift of storytelling, adding in all of the things that we identify with great stories. There's that person, a really good handful that eventually added up to the poems that we know today. So at some point they got written down. Thousands of other people had their extra little treatments that no one wanted to listen to, let alone write down. We have the Odyssey and the Iliad, but think of all the other stories of oral tradition, the incompetent, stupid, terrible stories that old doddering men sitting around these ancient Greek campfires are telling, that have no comparison to something like the story of Odysseus. And maybe there was a person seeing people writing down the Odyssey. And he turns to his friend and says, I have my story. How about I write my story down? And you could imagine somebody thinking, like, you want to write your horrible story down? Like, do you know how hard it is to write in ancient Greek? Like, no. And they're more of that confident storyteller 10 times over, objectively terrible at you know, literature is one of those like high arts. One of the reasons there's that sliding scale of what's objective and subjective is how much depth and richness and how difficult it's this really complicated machine that has to have so many wheels and gears spinning to come up with just a simple story. But it is primitive. It's a natural gut atavistic reaction that every human has as to whether or not something is engaging and interesting. It's one of the storytelling is one of the very few things that is unique to humans. You can tell straight away. I was actually thinking about storytellers and all the people that you know. Everyone knows 1 or 10 or a lot of people that you just, every time they come around, they're going to have a story that you don't want to listen to at all because it's bad, it's boring. I was thinking about an old coworker, one of those doddering old men that most of the stories will begin with, you know, back in my day, and then you'll hear some childhood story or a story of young adulthood that'll go nowhere. What I'm thinking about is all of those examples where the point of the story is that it was much better back then. And I would always kind of keep in mind the person that I'm thinking about that always was telling a story. There's not one time someone would go and say, hey, can you tell me one of those stories? Can you tell me another example of what it was like back then? We all want to hear. We want to hear this great story of yours. And this person, this coworker, I remember had a vacation, went on holiday. I lived in Maryland, and he went to Florida. So he had his vacation in Florida, and he's back at work. And of course, it's first thing in the morning, and everyone's kind of looking at their feet. He's dropping hints about how he just got back from his vacation. And finally, somebody breaks and says, well, how was your trip? And he starts his story with the day before packing. Not that anything interesting happened while I was packing, not a funny little thing or a little piece of drama, just the fact that the day before the trip, he had to pack. In his story, he makes a point to talk about his nap. The day before his trip, the day of his packing, the train's coming by again. I'm going to just keep talking. He mentions that he took a nap, and then he goes on from there. The next day, he has to get on the road, and he's driving down to Florida. This is all part of this great story. And objectively, not subjectively, it's terrible. Later in the day, and it's one thing to just tell a bad story. Later in the day, the same situation happens. There's another group of people, same coworker, dropping hints. Oh, my trip to Florida. Again, somebody breaks, somebody cracks. How was your trip? This guy, it blew my mind. I thought, like, dear God, holy moly! It's not that he was just started talking. He had his story. He started with the packing again. He brings up his nap again. Goes through his version of a story arc, beat by beat, and it blows my mind. That was his story. Amazingly boring and stupid, and that's probably not a really great example of what I'm talking about, but that little kernel, that nugget of just, completely clueless as to what people want to listen to. When you come to the written page, is a train, you'll have that on top of all of the other elements of what makes something competent. If somebody says that they're all books are subjective, and you can like some of them, and you can equally say that Shakespeare and John Green are equally as good, depending on just how you're feeling that day. It's ridiculous and silly and not really serious-minded. Very ungenerously, it's a cop-out. It's someone that can't stand by their own convictions. And for just a random example, with John Green, can't really just say, well, I like him. Maybe he's not the best. Maybe there's some faults, but I really enjoy it. I really get a kick out of it. And as far as trusting someone's opinion, it's important to contextualize how and why you appreciate it, and how you might compare and contrast it to other writers. The objective things that make something good or bad doesn't make those works rankable. It's just that they're identifiable. There's no serious conversation about, well, Thomas Hardy is a little bit better than Charles Dickens, or better or worse, or this is where I would place Thackeray. To kind of get that out of my mind is to think, like, how many books are just plain bad. I had recently, in the past year, somebody sent me their own self-published book, and I didn't make any videos about it because I read the first page, maybe a couple pages, but just like blindingly, blisteringly bad. And I do think there's a whole lot bad to the point where there's nothing to talk about, nothing to show. I wouldn't want to make a video just blasting someone that's trying, but just because you're trying doesn't make it good or redeeming to anybody else. Maybe to you and your people around you, and the publishers maybe, or people that are helping you try to get a little bit better, a teacher. If you're telling a story, you're telling it to an audience, and it's very clear, it's evident in print and spoken told by any means. Um, if you think about how many terrible stories you've heard in your life, the idea that, well, they're all subjective is just preposterous. Um, so those are just some of my thoughts about it. I think for the books that we're talking about, there's not much to quibble over definitions as far as it goes. We're you know, in a museum looking at all these great works. Some we like, some we don't. There's a whole ocean of those kind of works that will never be on any wall. So, some of my thoughts. Thank you for watching. Great discussion. It's been really fun listening to everybody have all their additions to this kind of discussion. So, thank you for everyone else. I'll try to leave links, or maybe I can find Christy Luis's playlist. I don't know if I can link that. But in any event, thank you for watching. Leave a comment if you would like, and take care.